Hi, Stephen here from Faded Crossings, and today I would like to discuss the primitive qualities of Aristotle and how you can use these to revolutionize the way you think about signs. The primitive qualities are actually subdivisions of the four elements. Everybody knows what the four elements are: earth, fire, water, air. We all know what these four elements are, but the primitive qualities make them up. And there are four primitive qualities that combine in different ways to make the elements. And in the classical world, this was considered to be very important because everything on earth was considered to be created from the elements. We are elemented things. That's how they put it. Elementata is the Latin word that they use. So we are all made up of the elements. We are all made up of a unique mixture of these primitive qualities. And as mentioned, there are four of them divided into two categories. So the first category of primitive qualities is active, and that is hot and cold. The second category of primitive qualities is passive, wet and dry. And we are to understand these in terms of form acting upon matter. So the active primitive qualities, hot and cold, were thought to be forms, meaning that they were generated by the mind of the universe. They resulted from the intellect, from the cognition of supernal, supercelestial beings. And so they're forms. And forms, hot and cold, act upon matter that is either wet or dry. And this formula allows all of the signs of the zodiac to arise. So all of the fire signs are hot and dry. Their active quality is hot, meaning that they take on the form of yang. They're active, outwardly pushing, radiating, outgoing, expressive, electric. And in the fire signs, they are operating on a very dry matter. So the passive quality of dry has to do with things that are rigid, has to do with destroying the bonds between things, breaking down connections. Whereas the passive quality wet has to do with creating bonds, creating connections. So if we were to think about this in terms of a mindset, a type of thinking, dry thinking is very logical. Everything it fits into different categories, whereas wet thinking is more intuitive and creative, where we are able to see the different connections between things, even if they don't seem to be related to each other on the surface. So the fire signs are hot and dry. And within the fire element, within the fiery triplicity of signs, we further differentiate them through the mode. So Aries is hot and dry, but it's also cardinal. Leo is hot and dry, but it's also fixed. Sagittarius is hot and dry, but it's mutable. Then the water element, its primitive qualities are cold and wet. Now, by cold, even though cold is an active primitive quality, they only called it active because it was thought to be acting upon matter. But in reality, the cold primitive quality is all about stasis. It's the exact opposite of hot. The cold primitive quality takes on the form of yin. It is very receptive. It is still inert, magnetic. And so the water element is comprised of a cold, active primitive quality that works upon a wet matter. The air element, like the fire element, is hot, but like the water element, is wet. And so this might generate some controversy because modern astrology likes to think of the air element as being cold. You know, we always hear about Gemini and Aquarius as being aloof, right? Disengaged, detached. And the primitive qualities of Aristotle directly contradict this because like the fire element, the air element is extrovert. It is outgoing. It is taking action. But like the water element, it sees hidden connections between things, and it establishes connections and bonds between people and other categories of events and things. So air is hot and wet, which finally leaves us with the earth element, which is cold. It has the active primitive quality of cold, meaning it is inert, it is receptive, it is still, it is more instinctive than the hot logical yang. And this cold active primitive quality operates on a dry matter. So for that reason, the earth element is very clear, very inflexible, and is all about destroying bonds and setting things up into their proper categories. Now, this is a very systematic way to think about the signs, and I'm talking about it today because I will use this doctrine consistently in the way that I handle signs from here on out. And so I need you to understand what wavelength I'm operating on here. That way there are no questions, and you can see the power of this the power of this concept. It allows us to think about astrology using the scientific method, as it were. So the signs are made up of the primitive qualities, but this also spills over into other categories in astrology as well, because the planets also have primitive qualities. The sun and Mars are hot and dry. They are hot, meaning they're outgoing, but they're dry, meaning they are rigid. They prize clarity. They break bonds down and separate things into appropriate categories. The moon is a special case because when she is waxing, she's said to be warm, but when she is waning, she's said to be cold. But in all cases, she moistens. She's a wet planet. And again, in the days of Ptolemy, who wanted to be a scientist, who wanted to go about this scientifically, thought of these in terms of the actions of the planets, so that when the planets go through the signs, they are exciting and stimulating the elements. And Mars and the sun would be actively heating up a sign and drying it out. So when you have Mars and the sun in a fire sign, a fire sign is already hot. It's already dry. But because these fiery planets are in them, they are increasing the heat, increasing the extroversion, increasing the outgoing nature, increasing also the dryness, the logical rigidity, the clarity of the dry primitive quality. These fiery planets increase that. But when you take a fiery planet like the sun or Mars and you put it in, say, Scorpio, then the heat of this fiery planet would be warming up the cold of Scorpio and would be drying it out a little bit. And so this would change Scorpio somewhat because these hot, dry planets are in them. So Mars and sun are hot and dry. Moon can be hot or cold depending on her phase, but she's always moistening things. Venus, they couldn't decide on. Some authorities said that Venus warmed things up, that she was a little hot, but others said that she was cold. They all agreed that she moistened things, that she was a wet planet. Jupiter is hot and wet. Saturn creates dryness and cold. Mercury can be either or. Mercury sometimes dries things out and sometimes moistens them. Mercury is sometimes hot and sometimes cold, depending on where he's at and with whom he is connected. Now, these categories of hot and dry, cold and wet, all of these primitive qualities, they not only affect the planets, but they also allow us to categorize planets and signs in terms of other important classifications. So, for example, when we get later on in future videos into the concept of sect, the dayness or nightness of a chart, then I will rationalize this concept in terms of hot and cold, wet and dry. The daytime was thought to be hot and dry. And so for daytime planets like the sun and Jupiter and Saturn, this was thought to strengthen them. Saturn especially was thought to do particularly well during the day because the heat of the day warmed Saturn up. And this was thought to balance him. Whereas Venus, Moon, and Mars are nocturnal planets, and they are more comfortable in the cool, moist, nighttime environment. Mars especially, the malefic nocturnal planet, is temperated and balanced because his heat is nullified by the coolness of the night, and his inflexible dryness is also moistened a bit and made to be more reasonable, made to be perhaps even more creative, more right brain during the night than during the day. So you can see how these primitive qualities of Aristotle not only allow us to understand the elements better, not only give us more tools for interpreting the signs and how the planets behave in them, but they also bleed over into other important categories within astrology itself. And when we get to medical astrology, you will see how important this is. It's absolutely vital for medical astrology because, remember, we are all comprised of the elements. Each person has a peculiar and distinct mixture of hot, cold, wet, dry. And so, since we are these elemented creatures, then the disease pathways that affect us also come from the elements. And so we would have hot and dry diseases, hot and wet diseases, cold and dry diseases, cold and wet diseases as well. And the astrologer physician of the Middle Ages would prescribe treatments, medicines, diets, and things like that in order to counteract the elemental imbalances of the diseases. Certainly, the primitive qualities, heat and moisture, were thought to produce life. They were thought to stimulate the what they called the fermentation of tissues, to stimulate the growth of tissues, whereas cold and dry were thought to break those tissues down and promote the decay of tissues, the breakdown of tissues, and death resulting from that. So now one important consequence of this is that understanding the primitive qualities of Aristotle allow us to take a more active stance with our charts. No longer do we have to say, well, I'm a Scorpio, or I'm a Leo, or I'm a Gemini, etc., and this explains my behavior. This is how I understand myself, and this is how I excuse my personal deficiencies, because it's my chart. The chart made me do it, and that's fine. We don't have to operate like that anymore. Understanding that life sometimes requires heat, and sometimes requires cold, sometimes requires activity, sometimes requires stillness, allows us to invoke the elements and to balance life and to establish an equilibrium where now we can manifest the active primitive qualities, the active primitive qualities of heat and cold when necessary, as opposed to just passively accepting our chart and just explaining away our behavior because we are a Leo or a Cancer or what have you. So this is probably a more refined and sophisticated way of looking at the signs, and it's how I roll in the majority of my interpretations. So just to summarize, the elements are made up of primitive qualities, and these primitive qualities themselves are constructed by forms, hot or cold, yin or yang, acting upon passive matter, wet or dry. So I hope this helps, and I look forward in future videos to demonstrating how the primitive qualities actually work in interpretation. So I hope you have a great holiday, and we will see you next week.